There was a single moment when Japanese generals sat in a room and knew, without any doubt, that they had already lost the war. And it wasn't when the atomic bombs fell. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. Japanese forces sweep across the Pacific like a tidal wave. American battleships sit at the bottom of harbors. British colonies fall in weeks. The Japanese Empire looks unstoppable. Every military calculation says they should win. Every strategic advantage belongs to them. But less than 4 years later, Japan surrenders unconditionally. What happened? When did the generals know? And more importantly, why did they keep fighting long after they realized the truth? To understand when Japanese generals realized they'd lost, we need to go back to before the war even started. Because here's the thing most people don't know. Many Japanese military leaders didn't even want to fight America in the first place. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, actually opposed going to war with the United States. He studied at Harvard. He traveled across America. He saw the factories in Detroit. He walked through the oil fields of Texas. And he came back to Japan with a warning that his colleagues didn't want to hear. Yamamoto told the Japanese government something that should have ended the war before it started. He said, "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, I have no expectation of success." Think about that for a second. The architect of Japan's most famous military victory was telling his own government that winning was impossible. But they didn't listen. Why? Because they believed in something called Decisive battle doctrine. Japanese military strategy was built on a concept borrowed from samurai tradition. One massive, overwhelming strike that would break the enemy's will to fight. It worked against Russia in 1905. It worked against China. So Japanese generals convinced themselves it would work against America. They thought if they could destroy the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and grab enough territory fast enough, America would negotiate peace. They believed Americans were soft, comfortable, not willing to die for islands thousands of miles from home. They were catastrophically wrong. But they didn't know that yet on December 7th. When news of Pearl Harbor reached Tokyo, there was celebration in the streets. Military officers toasted their success. Newspaper headlines declared a great victory. Emperor Hirohito himself praised the operation. For a brief moment, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The American battleships were destroyed. The Pacific lay wide open. Japanese forces moved faster than anyone thought possible. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. British forces in Malaya retreated in chaos. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore surrendered in February with over 80,000 troops. Burma, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines. One after another, Western colonies collapsed. In just 6 months, Japan conquered an area larger than the continental United States. It was the fastest military expansion in human history. General Hideki Tojo, Japan's prime minister and war minister, stood before the Diet and declared that victory was inevitable. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere would free Asia from Western imperialism. Japanese newspapers printed maps showing their empire stretching from India to Alaska. School children sang songs about the invincible imperial army. Everything looked perfect from Tokyo. But on the ground, some officers were starting to notice problems. Japanese supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. The navy that seemed so powerful was actually much smaller than it appeared. Every carrier, every cruiser, every destroyer was precious and irreplaceable. Japan's entire industrial capacity couldn't match what America was building in a single year. But the high command ignored these concerns. They were winning. Maps showed their empire growing every day. Why worry about industrial capacity when you're conquering half of Asia? Then came Midway. June 4, 1942. 6 months and 1 day after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's deadline. A Japanese fleet approaches Midway Island with 4 aircraft carriers, planning to lure out and destroy what remained of the American Pacific Fleet. The operation should have worked. Japanese carriers were the most experienced in the world. Their pilots had been training for years. They'd won every engagement so far. But American codebreakers had read their messages. They knew the Japanese were coming. The battle lasted 3 days. When it was over, all 4 Japanese carriers were at the bottom of the ocean. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu. Japan's most elite pilots drowned or burned. In 1 day, the Imperial Navy lost more carrier capacity than it could build in a year. And here's what made it worse. Those weren't just ships. They were floating cities of experience and expertise that couldn't be replaced. When news reached Tokyo, the government censored it. Newspapers weren't allowed to report the loss. Even within the military, only senior officers knew the full extent of the disaster. But those senior officers understood immediately what it meant. The war was only 6 months old and Japan's offensive capability was already crippled. Yamamoto's timeline had been exactly right. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of Japan's most aggressive strategic planners, later wrote that after Midway, he calculated Japan's chances of victory had dropped below 10%. But he didn't tell anyone. None of the generals did. Instead, they kept planning operations, kept sending young men to die, kept telling the public that victory was certain. Why? Because in Japanese military culture, admitting defeat was worse than death itself. The concept of face, of honor, of never surrendering, was so deeply embedded that rational strategic thinking became impossible. But some officers started keeping private journals, writing down their real thoughts in secret. These journals, discovered after the war, reveal something chilling. Many Japanese generals knew they were going to lose as early as mid-1942. They just couldn't say it out loud. Meanwhile, America was waking up. Remember how Japanese strategists thought Americans were soft? That they wouldn't have the stomach for a long war? They were about to learn how wrong they were. American factories shifted to war production on a scale that defied belief. Henry Ford's plant in Willow Run started producing one B-24 bomber every hour. Every single hour. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a new destroyer every week and a new aircraft carrier every month. Let me put this in perspective. In 1941, America built 3,000 aircraft. In 1944, America built 96,000 aircraft. That's more than Japan built during the entire war combined. The numbers were so absurd that Japanese intelligence officers thought they had to be propaganda. Nobody could build that much that fast. Except America could. And did. Japanese war planners received these intelligence reports and simply didn't believe them. They assumed American numbers were exaggerated. They had to be. Because if the numbers were real, the war was already over. But the numbers were real. And some Japanese officers were starting to understand what that meant. June 4, 1942. 6 months and 1 day after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's deadline. A Japanese fleet approaches Midway Island with 4 aircraft carriers, planning to lure out and destroy what remained of the American Pacific Fleet. The operation should have worked. Japanese carriers were the most experienced in the world. Their pilots had been training for years. They'd won every engagement so far. But American codebreakers had read their messages. They knew the Japanese were coming. The battle lasted 3 days. When it was over, all 4 Japanese carriers were at the bottom of the ocean. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu. Japan's most elite pilots drowned or burned. In 1 day, the Imperial Navy lost more carrier capacity than it could build in a year. And here's what made it worse. Those weren't just ships. They were floating cities of experience and expertise that couldn't be replaced. When news reached Tokyo, the government censored it. Newspapers weren't allowed to report the loss. Even within the military, only senior officers knew the full extent of the disaster. But those senior officers understood immediately what it meant. The war was only 6 months old and Japan's offensive capability was already crippled. Yamamoto's timeline had been exactly right. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of Japan's most aggressive strategic planners, later wrote that after Midway, he calculated Japan's chances of victory had dropped below 10%. But he didn't tell anyone. None of the generals did. Instead, they kept planning operations, kept sending young men to die, kept telling the public that victory was certain. Why? Because in Japanese military culture, admitting defeat was worse than death itself. The concept of face, of honor, of never surrendering, was so deeply embedded that rational strategic thinking became impossible. But some officers started keeping private journals, writing down their real thoughts in secret. These journals, discovered after the war, reveal something chilling. Many Japanese generals knew they were going to lose as early as mid-1942. They just couldn't say it out loud. Meanwhile, America was waking up. Remember how Japanese strategists thought Americans were soft? That they wouldn't have the stomach for a long war? They were about to learn how wrong they were. American factories shifted to war production on a scale that defied belief. Henry Ford's plant in Willow Run started producing one B-24 bomber every hour. Every single hour. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a new destroyer every week and a new aircraft carrier every month. Let me put this in perspective. In 1941, America built 3,000 aircraft. In 1944, America built 96,000 aircraft. That's more than Japan built during the entire war combined. The numbers were so absurd that Japanese intelligence officers thought they had to be propaganda. Nobody could build that much that fast. Except America could. And did. Japanese war planners received these intelligence reports and simply didn't believe them. They assumed American numbers were exaggerated. They had to be. Because if the numbers were real, the war was already over. But the numbers were real. And some Japanese officers were starting to understand what that meant. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who had conquered Singapore and earned the nickname Tiger of Malaya, wrote a private letter to a colleague in late 1942. In it, he admitted that Japan was fighting a war it couldn't win. He compared it to a rickshaw trying to race an automobile. No amount of courage or fighting spirit could overcome such a massive material disadvantage. But when asked about the war publicly, he gave confident speeches about certain victory. This disconnect between what Japanese generals knew and what they said created a bizarre situation. The high command was making plans they knew couldn't succeed, fighting battles they knew couldn't be won, all while maintaining a public facade of confidence. It was institutional delusion on a national scale. Then came Guadalcanal. The Solomon Islands campaign lasted 6 months. It was Japan's first major land defeat. Japanese soldiers starved because the Navy couldn't supply them. The Tokyo Express, their resupply runs, got picked off by American aircraft and submarines. When Japan finally evacuated in February 1943, they'd lost 24,000 men. But more importantly, they'd lost the initiative. From that point forward, Japan was in retreat. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Navy General Staff, told Emperor Hirohito in a private audience that Japan no longer had the resources for offensive operations. The best they could hope for was to make the Americans pay such a high price for every island that they would eventually negotiate peace. This was the new strategy. Die as expensively as possible and hope America gets tired. But there was a problem with this strategy. It assumed Americans thought like Japanese generals. It assumed there was a price too high to pay. It assumed America would value its soldiers' lives more than victory. These assumptions were wrong. President Roosevelt had already announced that only unconditional surrender would be accepted. There would be no negotiated peace. No compromise. Japan would either surrender completely or be destroyed completely. Some Japanese generals understood this. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome later testified that by mid-1943, anyone with access to intelligence reports knew that Japan had no chance of military victory. The only question was how badly they would lose. But the culture of the imperial military made it impossible to act on this knowledge. Officers who suggested peace negotiations were accused of defeatism. Some were assassinated by junior officers who believed surrender was dishonorable. So the war continued. And American power kept growing. The Gilbert Islands fell. The Marshall Islands fell. The Marianas fell. Each loss brought American bombers closer to the Japanese home islands. When Saipan was captured in July 1944, Japanese civilians committed mass suicide rather than surrender. The footage shocked Americans. But it terrified Japanese generals for a different reason. If civilians on Saipan chose death over capture, what would happen when the war reached mainland Japan? General Kuniakai Koiso, who became prime minister in July 1944, received a classified report from his intelligence staff. The report calculated that if current trends continued, Japan would be completely defeated within 1 year. Not might be defeated. Would be defeated. The math was unavoidable. American submarines were sinking cargo ships faster than Japan could build them. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had nearly stopped. The economy was collapsing. Food was being rationed. And American bombers were just starting their campaign against Japanese cities. Koiso read the report and ordered it burned. He told his staff that such defeatist thinking was unacceptable. Instead, he announced a new defensive strategy called Shogo. The plan was simple. Concentrate all remaining forces for one massive counterattack. One final decisive battle that would turn the tide. It was the same thinking that had started the war. And it was just as delusional. The target was the Philippines. When American forces landed at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan committed almost everything it had left. The entire combined fleet. Hundreds of aircraft. Thousands of elite troops. The battle lasted 3 days and was the largest naval engagement in history. When it was over, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Admiral Somu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, sat in his headquarters after the battle and didn't speak for hours. His staff later said he looked like a man attending his own funeral. Because in a way he was. The navy he had commanded no longer existed. And everyone in that room knew what it meant. Without a navy, Japan couldn't defend its empire, couldn't protect its supply lines, couldn't even defend the home islands properly. But still the war continued. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council met to discuss strategy. These 6 men, the Big Six, controlled Japan's war effort. 3 of them, including Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, wanted to find a way to end the war. 3 of them, including War Minister Korechika Anami, insisted on fighting to the last man. With the council deadlocked, no decision could be made. And so Japan kept fighting a war that its own leaders knew was lost. Meanwhile, a new terror was approaching from the sky. B-29s. American long-range bombers based in the Marianas. Starting in November 1944, they began systematic raids on Japanese cities. At first they tried precision bombing, hitting factories and military targets. But Japan's war production was scattered in thousands of small workshops throughout residential areas. You couldn't separate military targets from civilian populations. So American strategy changed. General Curtis LeMay took command of the bombing campaign in January 1945. He had a different approach. Japanese cities were made of wood and paper. They would burn beautifully. On the night of March 9, 300 B-29s dropped 1,900 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed over 100,000 people in a single night. It was the deadliest air raid in history. More people died that night than in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. When Emperor Hirohito surveyed the damage days later, his driver got lost because entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. Just ash and rubble stretching for miles. The emperor returned to his palace and asked his advisors a simple question. How many more cities can we lose before there's nothing left to defend? Nobody answered. Over the next few months, LeMay's bombers systematically destroyed 67 Japanese cities. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama. One by one, Japan's urban centers turned to ash. Industrial production collapsed. Transportation networks stopped functioning. Millions of civilians evacuated to the countryside. And still, the Supreme War Council couldn't agree to surrender. Here's what was happening inside the Japanese government. Everyone knew they'd lost. Every general, every admiral, every politician with access to classified information understood that defeat was inevitable. But they couldn't agree on what terms to seek. The peace faction wanted to surrender before the country was completely destroyed. The war faction insisted on impossible conditions. They wanted to keep the emperor's powers. No occupation of Japan. No war crimes trials. Japan would disarm itself. They were negotiating as if they had leverage. As if America needed to compromise. They didn't understand that America didn't care how long it took or how much it cost. Roosevelt had died in April, but Truman continued the policy of unconditional surrender. Either Japan surrendered completely or America would keep destroying cities until there was nothing left. Some Japanese generals proposed a final plan called Ketsugo, the decisive operation. When Americans invaded the home islands, every man, woman, and child would fight. Civilians would charge tanks with bamboo spears. Pilots would crash planes into ships. Soldiers would hide in caves and attack at night. They would make the invasion so costly that America would have to negotiate. Japan had 5,300 aircraft reserved for kamikaze attacks. Millions of civilians were being trained to fight. This was madness. But it was madness driven by a military culture that valued death over defeat. And it was madness that might have killed millions of Japanese civilians and hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. Then, on August 6, everything changed. A single B-29, the Enola Gay, dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima. The city vanished in a flash of light. 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from radiation over the following months. When news reached Tokyo, some generals didn't believe it. They thought it was American propaganda. One bomb couldn't destroy an entire city. But when reconnaissance planes confirmed the reports, something shifted. War Minister Anami, one of the most hardline officers, said quietly to an aide that if America had many of these bombs, continuing the war was suicide. Not honorable death. Just suicide. There was no glory in being vaporized by atomic fire. No way to fight back. No decisive battle. Just annihilation. 2 days later, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. This was perhaps even more significant than the atomic bomb. Japan's entire strategic plan for negotiated peace depended on the Soviets mediating between Japan and the Allies. With the Soviets now at war, that option vanished. Japan was alone. Surrounded. Being bombed from the sky and invaded from every direction. On August 9, A second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. That same day the Supreme War Council met to discuss surrender. The meeting lasted all day and all night. The peace faction and war faction remained deadlocked. War Minister Anami still insisted on conditions. He wanted to avoid occupation. He wanted Japan to conduct its own war crimes trials. He couldn't accept unconditional surrender even with 2 cities destroyed by atomic bombs and the Soviet Union invading from the north. Finally, at 2 in the morning on August 10, Prime Minister Suzuki did something that had never been done before. He asked Emperor Hirohito to break the deadlock, to make the decision himself. And the emperor, speaking in formal court language that some of the military officers could barely understand, said that the war must end, that the unendurable must be endured, that Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender unconditionally. Some officers wept. Some sat in stunned silence. War Minister Anami walked out of the room without speaking. The next day he would commit ritual suicide rather than witness the surrender. But the decision had been made. After nearly 4 years of war, after millions of deaths, after the destruction of 67 cities, after 2 atomic bombs, Japan would surrender. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. It was the first time most Japanese people had ever heard his voice. Speaking in the same formal court language, he announced that Japan had surrendered. He didn't use the word surrender. He said Japan would accept the joint declaration of the powers. Even in defeat, Japanese culture couldn't speak plainly about loss. But here's the question we started with. When did Japanese generals actually realize they'd lost? Not when did they surrender, but when did they know? The answer is complicated because it happened at different times for different people. Yamamoto knew before the war started. Other naval officers knew after Midway. Army officers realized it after Guadalcanal. Intelligence analysts understood by mid-1943. Members of the peace faction accepted it after the Philippines. But the most hardline generals didn't truly accept it until American atomic bombs proved that Japan could be destroyed from the air without an invasion. What's truly tragic is that Japanese generals kept fighting for years after they knew defeat was inevitable. They kept sending soldiers to die on Pacific Islands. Kept launching kamikaze attacks. Kept preparing civilians to fight with bamboo spears. All because their military culture made surrender unthinkable. Honor mattered more than lives. Saving face mattered more than saving cities. Let me tell you about a man named Hiro Onoda. He was a Japanese intelligence officer sent to the Philippines in 1944 with orders to conduct guerrilla warfare and never surrender. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Onoda didn't believe it. He thought it was Allied propaganda. So he stayed in the jungle. For 29 years. He finally surrendered in 1974 when his former commanding officer traveled to the Philippines to personally order him to stand down. Onoda isn't just a bizarre historical footnote. He's a perfect metaphor for what happened to Japan's military leadership. They received information that contradicted their worldview, so they rejected it. They kept fighting long after any rational analysis said the war was lost. They valued adherence to orders and preservation of honor more than adapting to reality. And this wasn't unique to Onoda. After Japan's surrender, pockets of Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific refused to believe the war was over. Some fought into the 1950s. The last confirmed holdout surrendered in 1974, the same year as Onoda. These men spent decades hiding in jungles, conducting raids, living in caves, because they couldn't accept that Japan had lost. The same mentality infected Japanese leadership during the war. Even when every piece of evidence said they were losing, they found reasons to keep fighting. When the navy was destroyed, they said the army would prevail. When cities burned, they said the people's spirit was unbreakable. When both atomic bombs fell, some generals still argued for continuing the war. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, founder of the kamikaze program, committed suicide after the surrender announcement. His suicide note said that he was apologizing to the spirits of the kamikaze pilots. Over 4,000 young men had died in kamikaze attacks. Onishi had sent them to their deaths believing it would save Japan. Now he knew it had been for nothing. But had it been for nothing? This is where the story gets even darker. Because some historians argue that the kamikaze campaign and Japan's fanatical resistance actually extended the war. That if Japan had surrendered earlier, America wouldn't have felt the need to use atomic bombs. That millions of Japanese civilians died because generals refused to accept the inevitable. Think about the timeline. Japan's military position was hopeless by late 1944. The Philippines were lost. The Navy was gone. American submarines had cut off oil supplies. Cities were being bombed. But Japan fought for 9 more months. 9 months during which American firebombing killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. 9 months during which kamikaze pilots crashed into ships killing thousands of sailors. 9 months that ended with atomic bombs. Could those 9 months have been avoided? If Japanese generals had accepted reality earlier, would Hiroshima and Nagasaki still have happened? It's an impossible question to answer with certainty. But we do know that American planning for the invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, estimated it would cost between 500,000 and 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties were expected to be in the tens of millions. Every man, woman, and child would have been mobilized to fight. The entire country would have become a battlefield. The atomic bombs killed over 200,000 people, a horrifying number. But Operation Downfall might have killed 20 times that many. Some Japanese generals understood this mathematics after the bombs fell. They realized that Hirohito's decision to surrender had saved Japan from complete annihilation. But by then 2 cities had already vanished in atomic fire. There's a Japanese concept called gamen. It means enduring the unbearable with patience and dignity. In his surrender speech, Hirohito told his people to endure the unendurable. He was asking them to do what was fundamentally against everything Japanese military culture had taught for decades. To accept defeat. To bow to conquerors. To admit that they had lost. For many Japanese people, especially the older generation who had supported the war, this was psychologically devastating. The emperor was supposed to be divine. Japan was supposed to be protected by the gods. The military had promised victory. How could it all have been a lie? American occupation forces arrived expecting resistance. They had seen how Japanese soldiers fought to the death on Pacific Islands. They assumed Japanese civilians would do the same. General Douglas MacArthur arrived at Atsugi Airfield with a handful of staff officers, surrounded by thousands of Japanese soldiers who still had their weapons. It should have been a suicide mission. But something surprising happened. The Japanese followed the emperor's orders. They laid down their weapons. They cooperated with occupation forces. They accepted defeat with the same discipline they'd shown in fighting. It was as if the emperor's voice had broken a spell. Permission to surrender from the one authority that outranked military honor made it possible to do what had been unthinkable days before. Over the following weeks, Japanese generals testified about when they knew the war was lost. Admiral Yanai said he'd known since Midway. General Yumizu admitted that Japan's strategic position had been hopeless since early 1943. Prime Minister Suzuki said he'd been working toward surrender since taking office in April 1945, but couldn't act because of military opposition. These testimonies revealed something disturbing. Japan's leadership had known for years that they were going to lose. But institutional momentum, cultural values, and the fear of appearing weak had kept them fighting anyway. Hundreds of thousands of people died in battles that Japan's own generals knew couldn't be won. And what about the men who had pushed hardest for war? General Tojo was arrested, tried for war crimes, and hanged in 1948. Admiral Yamamoto had been killed when American fighters shot down his plane in 1943. He never lived to see the defeat he'd predicted. Many senior officers committed suicide rather than face trial. Others disappeared into obscurity. But one document stands out. It was written by Prince Fumimaro Kono, who had been prime minister before Tojo. Kono wrote a memorial to the emperor in February 1945, 6 months before surrender. In it, he argued that Japan had already lost the war and that continuing to fight would only lead to communist revolution or complete destruction. He begged the emperor to end the war immediately. The emperor read Kono's memorial but took no action. Partly because he still believed the military might achieve a victory that would allow better surrender terms. Partly because he feared a military coup if he tried to make peace. So the war continued for 6 more months. Tokyo burned in March. Okinawa fell in June. Cities were destroyed weekly. And then came the atomic bombs in August. Reading Kono's memorial now, knowing what happened next, is haunting. He was right about everything. Japan was already defeated. Continuing the war led to catastrophic destruction. Surrender terms weren't improved by fighting longer. Everything that happened between February and August was preventable. But it wasn't prevented because Japanese leadership couldn't bring itself to admit defeat. This is the real answer to when Japanese generals realized they'd lost. Many of them knew by 1943 that military victory was impossible. But knowing you're going to lose and accepting defeat are two different things. Japanese military culture made it impossible to act on what they knew. So they kept fighting. Kept hoping for a miracle. Kept searching for a way to die honorably instead of surrendering practically. The lesson here isn't just about World War II. It's about what happens when institutions can't adapt to reality. When cultural values become rigid instead of flexible. When saving face matters more than saving lives. Japanese generals weren't stupid. They had access to excellent intelligence. They understood mathematics and logistics. But they were trapped by a system that punished truth-telling and rewarded blind loyalty. Think about all the warning signs Japan ignored. Yamamoto's prediction before the war. The intelligence reports about American industrial capacity. The string of defeats from Midway to the Philippines. The firebombing campaign. Even after 2 atomic bombs, some generals still wanted to fight. They were so invested in their narrative of honorable struggle that they couldn't see the obvious truth staring them in the face. And the cost was staggering. Japan lost over 3 million people in the war, most of them in the final year when the outcome was already decided. 67 cities were destroyed. The economy was in ruins. 2 cities had been hit by atomic weapons. The empire that had stretched from India to Alaska was gone. And for what? Because generals couldn't admit they'd made a mistake. Because politicians couldn't accept reality. Because a culture of honor prevented rational strategic thinking. The irony is that Japan recovered remarkably quickly after the war. The same discipline and work ethic that made Japanese soldiers fight to the death on Pacific Islands made Japanese workers rebuild their country into an economic powerhouse. Within 20 years, Japan had one of the world's strongest economies. The catastrophic defeat that generals feared would end Japanese civilization actually led to unprecedented prosperity. But that recovery came at a cost paid in blood and fire. It came after the destruction that might have been avoided if Japanese leadership had been able to do what Hirohito finally did in August 1945. Accept reality. End the unwinnable war. Choose life over death. So when did Japanese generals realize they'd lost? The truth is that many of them knew years before the surrender. They just couldn't bring themselves to act on what they knew. And that hesitation, that inability to adapt when faced with overwhelming evidence, that cultural rigidity that valued death over pragmatism, that's what really defeated Japan. Not American bombs or ships or soldiers. Japan defeated itself by refusing to see what its own generals already knew. The atomic bombs didn't teach Japanese generals that they'd lost. They already knew that. The atomic bombs taught them that they could no longer pretend otherwise. If you want to see more stories about the turning points of history that changed everything, check out the next video.